On April 16, 2025, a packed Philadelphia courtroom sat in near total silence as a soft-spoken man named Stephen Williams stood before Judge Rosemarie DeFino Nastasi. Dozens of family members filled the benches behind him, some wiping tears, others staring straight ahead with the hardened, exhausted expressions of people who had waited years for this exact moment. Prosecutors from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office rose and laid out what this quiet, unassuming man from West Oak Lane had actually done: 7 murders across Philadelphia between April 2018 and May 2019, carried out not in a fit of rage or a single explosive night, but methodically, over more than a year for money. What made the case so unsettling was not the body count alone, it was how completely invisible Williams had managed to remain while racking it up. He was not flashy, he never bragged on the corner, he barely showed up on social media at all. Detectives investigating each of these shootings individually had no reason to connect any of them to a single shooter, let alone one who blended so effortlessly into the everyday rhythm of Philadelphia life that neighbors struggled to remember his face even after learning who he was. It took ballistics matches, surveillance footage stitched together across neighborhoods, phone records, and eventually his own words to finally circle the investigation back to him. This is the story of how a man nobody really noticed became one of Philadelphia's most prolific freelance killers, precisely because he was the opposite of everything people expect a hitman to look like. 7 people across 7 different neighborhoods lost their lives to a shooter who studied their routines from a distance, who arrived and disappeared without leaving the kind of trail an ordinary criminal case relies on, and who managed to stay a ghost in the eyes of investigators for well over a year while the bodies quietly stacked up across the city he called home. West Oak Lane sits in northwest Philadelphia, a neighborhood longtime residents often call Uptown, defined by long rows of brick row homes stretching along the busy Ogons Avenue corridor. Barbershops stay loud with conversation, corner stores keep their lights on late, bus stops fill with people heading to work or school, and basketball courts echo with games running well into the evening. It is the kind of tight-knit place where everybody at least recognizes everybody else's face, even as street tensions simmer quietly underneath the day-to-day routine. Williams grew up near the 6900 block of Ogons Avenue, a stretch of the neighborhood sometimes associated in local chatter with a loosely defined group known as the 6900 O Guys, though no official records ever confirmed a formally organized crew by that name existed in any structured sense. In that environment, Williams picked up the street nickname White Boy, a label Philadelphia neighborhoods often apply to lighter-skinned or mixed heritage individuals moving through predominantly black communities. People said it casually for years, never imagining it would eventually surface inside homicide case files as a critical investigative lead. Friends who knew him described someone quiet in most settings, someone who rarely dominated a conversation or drew attention to himself on a crowded block, someone easy to overlook precisely because he gave people so little reason to remember him. But several of those same acquaintances later admitted they sensed something tense simmering underneath that calm exterior whenever real conflict entered the picture, a subtle shift in demeanor that only made sense to them in hindsight. One person who said he had crossed paths with Williams a few times would later write online that the guy had seemed cool, right up until people started putting together exactly what kind of situations surrounded him. Around that same period, a second nickname began circulating on Philadelphia social media pages tied to underground street discussion: Stain Man, a name connected to the idea of leaving enemies stained on the pavement after violent encounters. The label showed up on YouTube channels covering Philadelphia's drill scene long before the public understood exactly what it referred to, and through that slow drip of online chatter, Williams's reputation crept beyond his own block into other corners of the city, building a kind of underground notoriety that existed almost entirely separate from any official record. During his early 20s, he also picked up at least one confirmed firearms arrest, a detail court records later confirmed, and that would matter significantly to investigators trying to establish that he already understood weapons handling well before the first of the 7 murders occurred. Once detectives eventually looked backward after his arrest, they saw a young uptown resident who had drifted steadily closer toward serious violence, while his own neighbors still viewed him as nothing more than another quiet, familiar face on the block. By late 2017 or early 2018, investigators believed Williams had stepped into a specific and increasingly lucrative corner of Philadelphia's underground economy: contract violence. Drug traffickers, neighborhood power players, and organized crews occasionally look outside their own immediate circles for someone willing to eliminate a rival without any personal connection to the underlying conflict, precisely because that distance protects whoever actually ordered the killing. A freelance shooter with no obvious ties to either side becomes extremely valuable in that kind of arrangement. A name nobody would think to check first, someone whose presence at a crime scene raises no immediate red flags because he has no documented history with the victim or the people who wanted the victim gone. According to prosecutors, Williams did not simply wait around for people to approach him with offers. Detectives concluded he actively sought out those opportunities through street contacts who could connect him with people willing to pay to have a problem permanently removed. A level of initiative that distinguished him from someone who merely accepted whatever violent work happened to come his way. Stanley Crawford, whose own son would later become one of Williams's victims, put the underlying logic plainly during the case, explaining that a contract killer's entire job is finding people willing to pay for somebody else's death. Once Williams started operating in that world, each completed job expanded his reputation among the criminal networks that moved through Philadelphia's neighborhoods, since word travels fast in those circles whenever someone proves reliably willing to carry out dangerous work without hesitation or apparent remorse. Investigators later recovered text messages in which Williams referred to building what he called a mini graveyard, a phrase that captured a disturbing sense of pride in the growing number of deaths tied to his work. Language that read less like the anxious cover-up of a guilty man and more like a running tally he seemed almost eager to keep. Detectives described his method as methodical rather than impulsive. He studied routines, watched targets over time, and waited for the moment they let their guard down, often approaching by vehicle to strike at close range before disappearing again into the same anonymous flow of city traffic that had always shielded him. That patience, more than any single tactic, is what allowed him to operate across so many different neighborhoods for so long without a single case ever pointing directly back to him. A discipline that separates a genuine professional from the kind of impulsive street shooter who leaves an obvious trail behind almost every time. On the afternoon of April 23rd, 2018, detectives had no reason to think anything unusual was unfolding. Around 4:30 p.m., 30-year-old Kenneth Robinson sat inside a gray Chevy Cruze parked along the 600 block of Brill Street in Crescentville. Residents nearby heard several gunshots crack through the quiet of the block. Officers arriving minutes later found Robinson slumped behind the wheel with multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics rushed him to Einstein Medical Center, but the injuries proved too severe, and he was later pronounced dead, turning what had begun as a routine emergency call into a full homicide investigation within a matter of hours. Detectives canvassed the surrounding houses, hoping someone had seen the shooter or the vehicle used, but while several residents confirmed hearing the gunfire clearly, nobody claimed to have actually witnessed anyone fleeing the scene, a pattern of collective silence that would repeat itself again and again across nearly every one of Williams's shootings in the months that followed. What puzzled investigators most was the setting itself. Robinson had simply been sitting in his own car in broad daylight when someone got close enough to fire multiple rounds without drawing any attention beforehand. A level of calm confidence on the shooter's part that suggested premeditation rather than a chance encounter gone wrong. There was no sign of robbery, and Robinson's family insisted he had no known conflicts that could explain why anyone would want him dead. For months, the case sat open with no clear suspect and no confirmed motive. The shell casings and Robinson's own background offering investigators little to work with as the trail grew colder by the week, until prosecutors later revealed that Williams had admitted to killing Robinson as part of a paid hit arranged through criminal contacts. To this day, authorities have never publicly identified who actually paid for that killing or why Robinson specifically became the target that afternoon. A silence that allowed the case to blend quietly into Philadelphia's much larger list of unsolved homicides for years. Less than 3 months later, on July 10, 2018, 20-year-old Ramon Rosa was walking along the 6600 block of Blakemore Street in East Mount Airy shortly before midnight. Witnesses heard several sharp pops before watching Rosa collapse onto the sidewalk near the surrounding homes. Paramedics rushed him toward Einstein Medical Center, but the wounds were fatal. Detectives returned the next morning hoping daylight might reveal details lost in the chaos of the night before, but once again, residents who had clearly heard the gunfire could offer no useful description of the shooter, and without surveillance footage capturing the moment, investigators were left with another killing that appeared to have no obvious motive at all. A pattern that was beginning to repeat itself across the city without anyone yet noticing the common thread running through it. A thread that, in hindsight, had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Years later, prosecutors confirmed that Williams had also admitted involvement in Rosa's murder. though authorities never clarified precisely why the 20-year-old had been targeted, leaving his family with the confirmed killer's name, but still no real answer as to the underlying reason. At the time, nothing connected this East Mount Airy shooting to the Crescentville killing 3 months earlier. The victims lived in entirely different sections of the city, moved in separate social circles, and had no visible link to one another. That separation is exactly what allowed Williams to keep operating without a single shooter's name ever surfacing across 2 supposedly unrelated homicide files, each case handled by different investigative teams working independently with no shared database flag or pattern recognition system yet connecting the dots between them. The violence eventually landed directly in Williams's own neighborhood. Late on August 14, 2018, residents along the 6400 block of North Beechwood Street and West Oak Lane heard rapid gunfire tear through their quiet residential block. When police arrived, they found 29-year-old Laverne Jackson III lying wounded on the pavement, the victim of an attack witnesses described as sudden and overwhelming. Investigators later counted at least 11 shell casings scattered across the scene, a number that spoke to the sheer volume of gunfire unleashed in what was, by all appearances, a brief and chaotic burst of violence. Paramedics rushed Jackson to the hospital, but the damage was too extensive, and doctors pronounced him dead shortly after arrival. Years later, prosecutors revealed a devastating detail. Jackson's death had been a case of mistaken identity from the very start, a revelation that only made the tragedy harder for his family to process once they finally learned the full context surrounding his final moments. According to court statements, Williams drove the vehicle used in the attack while 2 other gunmen stepped out and opened fire, believing they had found their actual target, a man who reportedly lived near that same block. In the confusion of the nighttime encounter, the shooters got it wrong, and an innocent man paid with his life, while the person they were actually hired to kill was never even present at the scene, likely never even aware how close he had come to being killed that night. The Jackson killing exposed just how reckless contract violence could become when the people pulling the trigger barely knew the face of the person they were supposed to find, relying instead on second-hand descriptions, a general sense of where someone lived, and the kind of split-second judgment calls that leave no room for correcting a mistake once the shooting has already started. For a family that had no connection whatsoever to whatever conflict actually motivated the hit, the randomness of it made the loss even harder to process, a death with no real explanation beyond the fact that Laverne Jackson happened to be standing in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. On the evening of September 8, 2018, the violence struck miles away from Uptown, inside the Ronhurst section of Northeast Philadelphia. 35-year-old William Crawford had just parked near his home on the 1900 block of Hartel Avenue after returning from work. As he stepped out toward his driveway, a gunman approached suddenly and fired a single shot that struck him in the head. Neighbors ran outside after hearing the blast, and paramedics rushed Crawford to a nearby hospital, where doctors later confirmed the gunshot wound had killed him, ending an ordinary workday commute in a matter of seconds. What confused detectives early on was Crawford's background. Friends described him as a family man with no ties to street conflicts or criminal activity whatsoever, leaving investigators searching through his personal life, his job, and his social circle for anything that might explain why a shooter would target him outside his own front door, a search that turned up nothing resembling a motive no matter how deeply they dug. Nothing they found suggested he had ever crossed paths with anyone dangerous, which left detectives genuinely unsure whether they were looking at a case of mistaken identity, a random act of violence, or something far more calculated that simply hadn't revealed itself yet. Crawford's father, Stanley, refused to let the case quietly fade into Philadelphia's long backlog of unsolved homicides. After his son's funeral, he began speaking publicly, pushing officials to keep working the case, appearing at community meetings and reaching out directly to investigators to make sure his son's name did not simply disappear into a filing cabinet, and eventually created a project supporting other families dealing with unsolved murders across the city, turning his own grief into an ongoing advocacy effort that would outlast the initial investigation by years. During that time, witnesses began quietly mentioning a street nickname connected to rumors surrounding the shooting, White Boy. Detectives followed that lead once phone records placed Stephen Williams near the Hartel Avenue location around the time Crawford was killed, a detail that would only grow more significant once ballistic evidence entered the picture months later, transforming what had once been a vague and unconfirmed street rumor into a documented, verifiable connection between a specific suspect and a specific crime scene. By early 2019, the pattern connected to Williams had already stretched across several Philadelphia neighborhoods, even though nobody investigating any single case yet realized it. each detective working in isolation on what appeared to be its own self-contained mystery. During the early morning hours of February 10th, 2019, gunfire erupted again in West Oak Lane, along the 7500 block of Forest Avenue. 39-year-old Jermaine Simmons sat inside his car parked outside his own home when a black Lexus suddenly pulled up beside him. Witnesses described two shooters opening fire rapidly through the side window while Simmons remained trapped inside the vehicle with no realistic chance to escape the confined space of his own parked car. Emergency crews rushed him to Einstein Medical Center, where doctors attempted life-saving treatment, but the multiple gunshot wounds proved fatal. Years later, prosecutors explained that Simmons, like Jackson before him, had died as the result of another mistaken identity attack tied to the same contract killing operation. According to court records, Williams admitted to providing the Lexus used in the shooting while other associates carried out the actual gunfire, a division of labor that allowed him to remain one step removed from directly pulling the trigger in at least some of these incidents, even as he continued to be the connective thread running through nearly all of them. Investigators later determined that the real intended target lived nearby, and that the shooters believed they had located the correct person when they pulled up beside the parked car that night. Once the shooting ended, the attackers fled without ever realizing the man they had just killed had no connection whatsoever to the person they had actually been hired to eliminate. Another family left grieving a death that made no sense to anyone who actually knew the man they had lost. Only weeks later, on March 25th, 2019, 31-year-old Richard Isaac sat on the front porch of a home along East Meehan Street in East Mount Airy during the evening hours. Witnesses said a vehicle pulled slowly into the block while Isaac remained seated near the entrance to the house. Moments later, a shooter approached and fired several rounds that struck him in the chest and head. The emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but doctors pronounced him dead shortly after arrival. Unlike several of the earlier killings, investigators found real, usable evidence at this scene almost immediately, a turning point in an investigation that had until now been defined mostly by dead ends and unanswered canvases. Surveillance cameras positioned along nearby streets had captured footage of a car following Isaac's vehicle through several blocks in the moments before the shooting. Detectives traced that car's registration directly back to Stephen Williams, the first time his name had surfaced with any real evidentiary weight behind it, rather than simply as a rumor circulating through the neighborhood, a breakthrough that shifted the entire direction of the investigation almost overnight. Phone records recovered around the same period added another disturbing layer. Text messages sent shortly after the shooting included photographs of Isaac's body, which prosecutors later argued Williams had taken to confirm to whoever hired him that the job had actually been completed, treating the killing as a transaction that required proof of delivery in the same way any other paid service might. Then came the piece of forensic evidence that finally connected two previously unrelated cases, the kind of breakthrough that only becomes possible once separate investigations start actually talking to each other. Ballistic analysts compared shell casings recovered from the Isaac scene against evidence collected months earlier from William Crawford's killing in Northeast Philadelphia. The results matched. The exact same firearm had been used in both shootings, finally linking two homicides that had, until that moment, appeared to have absolutely nothing to do with each other and giving investigators their first solid confirmation that a single shooter was operating across multiple, seemingly disconnected neighborhoods. Weeks after Richard Isaac's murder, one more killing unfolded that would ultimately mark the last known victim connected to the contract killing spree. On May 4th, 2019, 46-year-old Leslie Carroll sat inside his parked vehicle near the intersection of North 20th Street and West Girard Avenue in the Francisville section of Philadelphia. Evening traffic moved normally around him until another vehicle pulled up alongside the driver's side door. Gunfire erupted moments later as the shooter inside that second vehicle opened fire directly on Carroll. Witnesses described the attack as brief but extremely violent, and the attacker sped off through nearby streets almost immediately afterward. Emergency crews rushed Carroll to Temple University Hospital, where doctors attempted to stabilize him, but the injuries were too severe to overcome. Investigators later recovered surveillance footage from nearby buildings that helped reconstruct the lead-up to the shooting, showing a vehicle linked to Williams following Carroll's car through several blocks beforehand, the same pattern of patient, deliberate tracking that had already shown up in the Isaac case months earlier, and that would, in hindsight, come to define the way investigators eventually understood Williams's overall method. Phone records recovered during the investigation revealed that Williams had once again sent images connected to the victim shortly after the attack, matching the same disturbing pattern investigators had already uncovered following Richard Isaac's murder 2 months earlier, a repeated behavior that, by this point, read less like coincidence and more like an established personal ritual tied to how he confirmed and reported his completed work to whoever was paying him. By the time Carol died that evening, 7 people had lost their lives across a 13-month span, all eventually connected to the same hidden network of paid violence: Kenneth Robinson, Ramon Rosa, Laverne Jackson, William Crawford, Jermaine Simmons, Richard Isaac, and now Leslie Carroll himself, each murder occurring in a different Philadelphia neighborhood, investigated at the time as an isolated, unrelated case, and each one a piece of a puzzle that would take investigators far longer to assemble than it took Williams to carry out the killings in the first place. While detectives continued working through the growing list of shootings, another name quietly surfaced inside investigative files connected to Philadelphia's drug underworld: Edine Fulton, known on the street as Hammer, a major trafficker running a large narcotics network across parts of the city. Federal authorities had already been studying Fulton's organization for years over suspected cocaine and heroin distribution, and during that separate investigation, agents noticed that certain individuals associated with Stephen Williams also maintained ties to Fulton's criminal circle, an overlap that only became apparent once investigators started cross-referencing names across previously unconnected case files. Prosecutors later theorized that Williams may have carried out several of his killings on behalf of figures connected to that same network, functioning as a contractor drug traffickers could call on whenever a rival or a suspected informant needed to disappear without leaving an obvious trail back to the organization itself. A role that made him valuable precisely because he existed outside the normal chain of loyalty and suspicion that governs most street-level conflicts. That entire underground ecosystem shifted violently on February 25th, 2020, when Fulton himself became the target of a brutal ambush. Gunmen attacked him inside the garage of his Manayunk home while he sat in a vehicle pulling into the property, unloading what police later described as dozens of rifle rounds into the SUV and killing him instantly. An assassination carried out with a level of firepower and coordination that suggested planning far beyond a simple robbery or personal dispute. The assassination shook Philadelphia's criminal landscape at almost the exact moment investigators were closing in on Williams through an accumulating web of phone records, ballistics matches, and surveillance footage tied to the string of killings across the city. By June 2020, prosecutors formally charged Williams with several of the murders. He was already sitting in custody at the time, serving a sentence on unrelated gun charges, when detectives arrived with the homicide warrants that finally connected his name to 7 deaths, closing the loop on an investigation that had, until that point, spanned multiple neighborhoods, multiple detective squads, and more than 2 years of quiet, patient work. Years passed between that arrest and the final resolution of the case. In December 2024, Williams appeared in a Philadelphia courtroom where prosecutors laid out the evidence tying him to the killings, and facing what they had assembled, he entered guilty pleas connected to the murders of William Crawford, Jermaine Simmons, Richard Isaac, and Leslie Carroll. Additional pleas followed in early 2025, covering the earlier killings of Kenneth Robinson, Ramon Rosa, and Laverne Jackson. Through those admissions, the quiet man from West Oak Lane formally acknowledged responsibility for 7 deaths spread across more than a year and across a wide swath of Philadelphia neighborhoods, a formal accounting that finally gave each family a confirmed answer after years of uncertainty. Pennsylvania Attorney General Michelle Henry summarized the case bluntly at the time, stating that the defendant had callously taken lives for dollars as a paid killer, describing Williams as someone who had approached murder as though it were simply another line of work. A transactional mindset that prosecutors argued ran through every single one of the 7 cases. Family members of the victims packed the courtroom throughout the sentencing hearings that followed, describing how a single moment of sudden violence had permanently reshaped their lives. Parents and spouses and children spoke about birthdays that would never be celebrated again, empty chairs at family gatherings, and years spent waiting for even the smallest piece of information about who had killed the people they loved and why. Testimony that filled the courtroom with a heaviness that lingered long after each individual statement ended. In April 2025, Judge DeFino Nastasi handed down the final sentence after weighing the guilty pleas alongside those victim statements, ordering Williams to serve between 40 and 80 years in prison. Some relatives said afterward that the sentence still felt too light given the sheer number of lives lost, a sentiment shared by more than one family who had hoped for something closer to a guarantee that Williams would never again see the outside of a prison under any circumstances. Others focused on the fact that the man responsible would almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars rather than ever walking through their neighborhoods again, taking what comfort they could from the practical reality of a sentence that would likely outlast him. What makes Williams's case worth remembering is not simply the body count, grim as it is, but what it reveals about how contract violence actually operates beneath the surface of a major American city. He was never the person anyone expected. He did not fit the loud, visible profile most people associate with a hired killer. He blended into ordinary blocks, kept a low profile online, and let each individual murder sit in its own separate case file for months or years before investigators ever recognized the pattern connecting them, a gap in detection made possible by the very structure of how homicide cases are typically assigned and worked. One detective or one small team assigned to one specific incident, with little built-in mechanism for spotting a shooter operating quietly across an entire city. Several of his victims, including at least 2 men killed in cases of outright mistaken identity, had never even met him before the moment he or his associates opened fire. That distance between shooter and target is precisely what makes contract killing so difficult to trace and so devastating when it finally comes undone. A stranger, hired through a chain of intermediaries, arriving to end a life over a conflict that had nothing to do with him at all, then disappearing back into the same quiet neighborhood routine as though nothing had happened, indistinguishable from every other person walking down Ogons Avenue on an ordinary afternoon. Long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras moved on, the families of Kenneth Robinson, Ramon Rosa, Laverne Jackson, William Crawford, Jermaine Simmons, Richard Isaac, and Leslie Carroll were left to keep rebuilding lives that had been interrupted without warning by a man most of them had never even heard of until his name finally surfaced in a homicide file. The quiet man from West Oak Lane had, after more than a year of moving unseen through the city, finally been seen. For 7 families, that recognition arrived only after the answers they had been waiting for had already cost them everything. There is also something worth sitting with in how long it actually took for the pattern to emerge, given how much physical evidence existed from the very beginning. Shell casings sat in evidence lockers for years before ballistics comparisons finally linked separate cases together. Surveillance footage from different neighborhoods captured the same vehicle on more than one occasion without anyone realizing the significance until much later. Phone records placed Williams near multiple crime scenes long before investigators had any reason to cross-reference those locations against one another. None of the individual pieces of evidence were hidden or destroyed. They simply sat scattered across separate investigations, each one treated as its own isolated puzzle rather than as part of something larger, exactly the kind of gap that allows a patient, methodical shooter operating across an entire city to remain invisible for far longer than seems possible in hindsight. That gap is not unique to Philadelphia, and it is not unique to this particular case. It reflects a broader challenge that homicide units in large American cities face constantly. The sheer volume of unsolved shootings competing for limited investigative resources, the reluctance of witnesses to come forward in neighborhoods where cooperation carries its own risks, and the difficulty of recognizing a pattern that spans multiple jurisdictions, multiple detective squads, and more than a year of time. Williams did not need to be a criminal mastermind to exploit that gap. He simply needed to be patient, methodical, and willing to keep operating for as long as the system took to catch up with him. In the end, it was not a single brilliant breakthrough that finally brought the investigation together, but the slow, cumulative weight of ballistics matches, phone records, and surveillance footage, each piece meaningless on its own, becoming undeniable only once enough of them had finally been laid side by side. It is also worth remembering just how ordinary Williams's public life appeared throughout this entire period. He was not hiding in a bunker or living off the grid. He was still recognizable to neighbors, still moving through the same barbershops and corner stores that defined West Oak Lane's daily rhythm, still someone people occasionally crossed paths with on the block without a second thought. That normalcy was not an accident. It was, in its own way, the most effective tool he had, a form of camouflage built not from disguise or deception, but from simply being unremarkable enough that nobody thought to look twice, even as the number of people connected to his violence continued climbing month after month behind the scenes.